No record remains of what was said during the vote. The name of the man behind the dagger was never officially revealed. But things did not go as many believed. He was stabbed by two men in the street. It happened fast. And for a few seconds, no one understood what had just occurred. No orders were shouted. No warnings were given. The crown was close, but the blood reached first. Tyre, April 1192. Conrad of Montferrat had just been elected king by the High Lords. The decision had been made. No banners yet, no priests, just waiting. Jerusalem no longer had a throne to sit on, but it still had men willing to fight over the idea of one. And in that silence, between victory and ritual, someone moved. Not everyone agreed he should be king, but he was the only one who hadn't failed yet. The crown didn't come to him by birth. It came through loyalty, through walls held under siege, through days when the city stood only because he did. It came because no one else could keep the Crusader kingdom from crumbling. To understand why they chose Conrad, you have to start where he did. In a city surrounded, in a court divided, and in a kingdom breaking apart from within. They didn't love him, they didn't even want him. But when every other name had collapsed under failure, disgrace, or weakness, only one man was still standing behind the walls of Tyre, and it was Conrad of Montferrat. His claim to the throne of Jerusalem was not born of bloodline, but survival. While Guy of Lusignan watched the holy city fall, and Richard I clashed with barons in Acre, Conrad held the coast. When Saladin swept across the Crusader states like a blade, carving cities into silence, only Tyre stood, and it stood because Conrad refused to leave it. He wasn't crowned for what he promised. He was elevated because everything else had rotted away. He didn't inherit the crown, he withstood it. Conrad had shown up in the East late compared to other barons, but when he arrived in 1187, Tyre was already under siege. Most nobles would have negotiated, fled, or died. He reinforced the gates, reorganized the garrison, repelled wave after wave of Saladin's men. While other cities crumbled, he created a stronghold from rubble. That wasn't how kings were supposed to rise, but that's how this one did. Still, not everyone bowed easily. Guy of Lusignan had royal favor from the past and backing from Richard. The French barons were split. The clergy hesitated. Some said Conrad was too independent, too cold, too foreign, a man of war, not ritual, a man of fortresses, not courts. But the truth was simpler. No one else could hold what was left. He didn't rise because he was meant to. He rose because the Crusader kingdom was disintegrating, and no one could stop the bleeding. He wasn't crowned in gold. He was covered in the dust of siege and the stench of nobles who waited too long to act. His authority wasn't declared, it was defaulted. He wasn't chosen because they believed in him. He was chosen because belief had already failed. By the time the vote came in 1192, there was no celebration, just agreement. Quiet, reluctant, the kind that sounded like surrender. The kingdom didn't have a future. It had Conrad, and that was enough for now. But holding the city was one thing. Holding the crown was something else entirely. The moment the vote was announced, something shifted. The silence wasn't relief, it was recoil. Conrad of Montferrat had been declared king, but not a single bell rang in Tyre. No procession, no feast, no crowned figure walking into the church. Only nods, brief, and eyes that didn't hold. He had defended their last stronghold. But power in the East wasn't granted by survival alone. It needed blessing, legitimacy, favor from Europe, and Conrad had none of those. He wasn't from the royal line. He didn't have Richard's backing. His name wasn't chanted in chapels. He was simply the man who hadn't fallen yet, and that terrified them more than failure itself. They needed him. But they feared what he might become. The French lords were split. Some hated the English. Some distrusted Conrad. Others stayed silent. Guy of Lusignan, whose claim had already sunk Jerusalem, still held favor with the English king, who treated him like a brother-in-arms. Richard didn't openly oppose Conrad, but he didn't bless him either. Letters went unanswered. Ceremonies were delayed, and the church, always slow to move, gave no sign it would anoint him. So Conrad walked the city not as king, but as a man surrounded by uncertainty. Streets he had once patrolled during siege now stared back at him like stone galleries with locked doors. The soldiers respected him, the walls obeyed. But within the court, whispers moved faster than any blade. Some asked if the vote had been rushed. Others hinted that a man without royal blood should not wear a crown tied to Christ's own tomb. He had won the throne. But the throne refused to hold him. In private, the mood was worse. Diplomats from Europe treated him like a placeholder, nobles still loyal to Guy withheld support. Even his own allies looked at him like a weapon they were afraid to hold. Conrad had survived siege. He had defeated armies, but this was different. This was a crown suspended by threads. And the longer he wore it, the more hands reached for the scissors. By the end of April, the coronation still had no date, no bishop, no oil, just a man walking toward a title everyone had agreed on, but no one was willing to see realized. He was king, but no one had dared to say it aloud. And that silence, it wasn't neutral. It was planning something, waiting, watching. Because while Conrad watched for enemies beyond the walls, his death was already moving inside them. He stepped outside unguarded. That was the first mistake. It was late afternoon in Tyre. Conrad had just left a private meal with the Bishop of Beauvais. No ceremony, no procession, just another closed-door conversation in a city where every decision whispered louder than it spoke. He walked with one attendant. The streets weren't empty, but they weren't packed either. Warm, grey stone underfoot, people moving about their errands, nothing unusual. Then came the knife. Two figures stepped in from the side. Maybe young, maybe not. No one could say. But they were calm enough to walk through a crowd toward a would-be king with knives hidden and minds already made. One leaned in as if to speak. The other struck. A blade went deep into Conrad's side. Then another. He staggered. For a moment the air held. A heartbeat passed. And then someone screamed. The sound spread. People turned. Some shouted. Others froze. The street twisted into confusion. Not a riot, not a stampede, but that awful human mess when no one knows what's happening, only that something is terribly wrong. Soldiers came running. One attacker was caught and killed. The other vanished into the stone veins of the city. Conrad didn't die on the street. He was carried home, blood soaking through silk, lips tightening with pain. He lived through the evening, but not the night. The wounds cut deeper than his body. They severed a fragile thread holding the kingdom together. And when he slipped away, there was no crown, no procession, no king. He had survived siege, outlasted enemies, been chosen reluctantly, bitterly, as the only man left who might hold the kingdom together. And just days before the oil could touch his forehead, someone made sure it never would. The city didn't mourn, it murmured. There was no great bell tolling across Tyre, just quiet funeral rites and louder questions. Who had ordered it? Who gained the most? The Bishop of Beauvais had left minutes before the attack. Guy of Lusignan said nothing. Richard of England made no official statement. The church had not yet blessed the crown. The Templars offered no explanation. The blade had moved, but no hand claimed it. It wasn't just a man who died. It was a decision, a future, a fragile balance. And now, with Conrad's body cooling, the power he held, however briefly, was up for grabs again. Only this time, the vultures were faster, hungrier, and better, prepared to rip the kingdom apart. No one said they ordered it, but no one truly mourned either. The day after Conrad's death, the city moved on with a stillness that didn't feel natural. The shops reopened. The church carried out brief, proper rites. A few nobles stood by the bier out of duty, not devotion. Behind every glance was the same question no one dared voice aloud. Who would be next in line, not just for the crown, but for the consequences? Some whispered that the assassins had acted alone. Others pointed quietly toward Richard. After all, Richard had backed Guy of Lusignan, and Conrad's sudden rise had cornered him politically. Still, there was no proof, no letter, no witness. Just a corpse and a kingdom waiting for someone to pretend it hadn't happened. The Bishop of Beauvais had been with Conrad hours before the attack. He claimed surprise. So did Guy. So did every man who stood to benefit. The surviving assassin, captured before he could flee, confessed under pressure. He named the assassin's leader in the east, saying the mission had come from the fabled old man of the mountain. But why would the assassins, a secretive sect of distant Syria, care who ruled a Crusader kingdom in Tyre, and who paid them? That part was never clarified. Convenient. The truth is, there may never have been a single mastermind. Only permission, a signal, or maybe not even that, just a silence so long and deliberate it could only mean yes. And once the blood was spilled, that silence thickened. The streets didn't cry out for justice. The barons didn't demand an inquest. The Pope sent no outrage. The blade had done what words no longer could, and the world let it stand. The crown had been floating, ownerless, for less than a day, and yet already hands were moving. A message was sent to Henry of Champagne, another high noble with French blood and Crusader ambition. Not the most obvious heir, but he had ties, and more importantly, he had no enemies yet. His name was spoken softly at first, then louder, then with the weight of inevitability. And while Conrad's body was still cold, Henry was making preparations, not for vengeance, not for answers, for the wedding. He would marry Isabella, Conrad's widow, the queen, and take the crown through her. Just days later, the kingdom never paused to breathe. It inhaled chaos and exhaled politics, and no one looked back. Because in Tyre, and in every court that watched from Rome to Acre, one truth had settled: no crown is ever truly vacant. Someone always steps forward, whether they deserve it or not. And so the mourning ended before it could begin. Not with a dirge, but with a proposal. They said she wept, but no one could agree on how long. Isabella of Jerusalem had just lost her second husband, stabbed to death in daylight days before their coronation. She had known loss before. She had been married at 15, then passed between men like a seal of sovereignty. Now, before her widow's veil could even gather dust, new hands were reaching for her again, not out of love, out of need. Henry of Champagne was the man they chose, or perhaps the man who chose himself. He was royal by blood, related to Richard of England and Philip of France. That alone made him acceptable. But more importantly, he was untouched by the bitterness that had split the Crusader nobility. He had no feud with Conrad, no ties to Guy. He was blank parchment, clean enough to write the next chapter without ink bleeding in from the last. And so, while the city still whispered about knives and assassins, Henry was making arrangements, not for justice, for marriage. There was no waiting period, no pause for mourning. Isabella was summoned. Some said she agreed willingly. Others that she had no choice. What is certain is that the wedding took place less than 8 days after Conrad's death. A ceremony, hasty and official, witnesses, vows, a new king by virtue of her name, her body, her lineage. And the old king, barely spoken of again. It wasn't a union, it was a solution. The barons accepted it. The church did not protest. Even Richard, who had watched the chaos from Acre, raised no objection. Perhaps it was relief. Perhaps it was design. But the message was clear. This kingdom would not wait for ghosts. Blood dries, power moves on. And if a widow weeps, she does so behind palace doors, not on the steps of a throne that must never remain empty. Isabella became queen again, this time not beside a fighter, but beside a negotiator. Henry would rule not with iron, but with balance. And yet, everyone understood. The crown he wore had been paid for by a man he never had to kill. In Jerusalem's shadow, love had long been replaced by leverage. And now, with Henry crowned and Isabella quiet beside him, the Crusader state exhaled. Not in peace, but in resignation, because there would be no reckoning for Conrad. No truth uncovered, no hand punished. Only a wedding and the silent understanding that the dagger had cleared the path more effectively than any treaty ever could. Conrad's death didn't trigger a war, it did something worse. It drained the will to keep pretending there was still a cause. In the weeks that followed, the Crusader kingdom didn't collapse in a roar, it dulled into a hush. Acre remained in Christian hands, but it felt brittle. Tyre kept its gates shut a little tighter. The name Jerusalem was still written on banners, but fewer men believed it would ever be more than a word. The crown had moved on to Henry of Champagne. Isabella stood beside him, and life continued. But it was the kind of life that flickers after something's been broken too many times to hold shape, like patching a cracked sword with wax. The factions that had once fought for the same cross now avoided each other's eyes. Richard of England still held presence in the region. Guy of Lusignan vanished into the background, stripped of relevance but not resentment. The Templars offered no explanation. The Hospitallers withdrew into their stone halls. And the barons, they stopped asking questions, not because they got answers, but because they understood too well what answers might cost. Every lord, knight, merchant, priest, each had begun drawing smaller circles around themselves. No more grand campaigns, no more united strategy, just quiet retrenchments, quiet defenses, quiet mistrust. And somewhere in that quiet, the dream of the Holy Land cracked for good. Not with a defeat on the battlefield, not with a heresy declared, but with a silence that followed a king's murder and a wedding that proved how easily power could be passed with a kiss instead of a crown. The people didn't rise up, the clergy didn't rage, and no third army came. The kingdom was still there, on maps, in letters, in titles, but inside, the heart had stopped. The crown no longer had gravity. It passed from hand to hand like a warm stone, impressive to hold, meaningless to keep. By the end of that year, rumors had already begun to ripple across the sea. Whispers that the kingdom was hollow, that the men who ruled it did so out of fatigue, not faith, that Jerusalem might still be fought for, but never truly lived in again. And still, Henry reigned. Isabella followed. The blood on Tyre's stone had faded in the sun. And Conrad became a name with no justice attached, just a gap in memory and the unspoken agreement that perhaps this was easier, safer, quieter, but what no one said out loud, they all knew. If silence could kill one king, it could always kill another. They buried Conrad without a crown, and they crowned another without a trial. That's how it ended, quietly, formally, with titles handed out like favors, and no one daring to look too long at the wound still fresh in the city's stone. 2 men had stabbed him, no one had stopped them, no one chased them down the alleys of Tyre. They vanished into the dust of history, unnamed, unpunished, unspoken. Some said they were assassins, agents of a distant sect with knives for politics. Others whispered they served Richard himself. A few accused Guy's camp. A few dared mention the Templars, but none of those names appeared in any official scroll. No witness testified, no tribunal convened. And so the questions decayed faster than the corpse. A king murdered in broad daylight. No riots, no inquiry, just a wedding 8 days later and a silence that settled like mildew across every carved pillar of power. The Holy Land had seen betrayal before, but this was different. This wasn't a coup, it wasn't rage, it was hollow, a political space that absorbed the violence without flinching, like a kingdom trained to forget as soon as it bled. Years later, travelers would pass through Tyre and ask where the king had fallen. Some locals shrugged. Some said they couldn't recall. Some still remembered the blood in the street, the crowd gathering too late, the way no one screamed at first because they didn't yet understand that something irreversible had just happened. But there was no plaque, no trial, no reckoning, just dust and stone and a name that faded faster than it rose. And yet even now, centuries later, something about the way it all vanished still doesn't sit right. Not the knife. Not the men, not the speed, not the silence. Something in that moment cracked more than just one man's ribs. It fractured the belief that history always leaves answers, that power plays fair, that crowns are earned. Conrad's story didn't die with him. It dissolved by design, and maybe that's the lesson, that some kings are easier to kill than to remember. History didn't clear the blood, it just walked around it. If the death of Conrad left you uneasy, you're not alone. Because sometimes silence isn't forgetfulness, it's protection. Protection for the names that never made it into the scrolls, for the men who benefited, for the powers that rearranged themselves before the body was even cold. And if one political death can vanish this easily, how many others have we already stepped over? For another royal erased through silence, watch The Princes in the Tower. Two brothers vanished inside a fortress, and the truth never came out. Or go back further to the execution of Conrad, a young king beheaded in front of a crowd to stop a bloodline from rising. And if you want more stories they don't teach in school, but that shaped everything around us, subscribe to the channel. Your click helps this history stay alive when the world tried so hard to bury it.